Drop Dead City is the first ever documentary about the New York City Fiscal Crisis of 1975, an extraordinary and often overlooked episode in urban American history that saw an already crumbling city of 8 million people brought to the edge of bankruptcy and social chaos by a perfect storm of greed, incompetence, ambitious social policy, and poor governance. Truly remarkable documentary film if you are looking for a film that is a how-to, a masterclass in telling a complex story with clarity, with insight, and with a sense of history. This is your documentary, Drop Dead City. We're joined today by the co-directors of Drop Dead City, Peter Yost and Michael Rohatyn. To both of you, welcome to the program.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned to you before we got started, I am old enough, unfortunately, I guess in some ways, that I remember this, and I remember what a seismic kind of event it was during the period of time that America cared about New York when this was happening. And for a lot of reasons, that New York City was so fascinating during that period of time to us as a country. And it became emblematic of a lot of things that were to follow after this particular episode in New York City. There was a lot of the same kinds of things going on around the country. But which one of you got this operation underway?
Peter and I are friends from, a lot of other areas, not film. And one day we were chatting about this period in New York history. And it dawned on us that this had never really been done as a documentary for all of the good reasons. It's a very complicated, very possibly wonky story. But somehow this period of time had just been passed over. And there's so many good documentaries about New York City. And I have had and still have access, because of my connection to the story, to a lot of the people who are in the story. And so we decided to go and dig around and see if there was a story to be kind of made out of it, and began shooting interviews pretty randomly with no script, with really no form. And almost right away, we started to really love who the characters were that we were talking to, as well as what they were telling us about the story. And then we pulled some archive, and out of the very first batch, it was just like, wow, this is pretty good. So
I'm sure at some point in your endeavors, you began to see some sort of focus in or at least out the broad outlines of a story, but it is a complex story. And it must have looked like a big ball of spaghetti at some point as you were trying to put this thing together in the coherent and cohesive way that we see in this film. Peter, at what point if that question came up to you, what do we have here? Go ahead.
That question continues to be answered by the day. No, I think we have hopefully finally cracked it. People have really responded favorably, and it's been quite popular in the screenings we've had thus far in the release. So I think we are telling a coherent and engaging story, but as you say, it took us a long time to find it. Michael had incredible endurance sticking with that story because we went down a lot of dead ends. I think the big crack open that took us a bit of time, we knew that this was a key year, that there were repeated crises that the city faced. But from a storytelling standpoint, it was a bit of a problem because it was sort of what you would call a rolling crisis. The same thing happened and they got over that hump. The city didn't go bankrupt. And then a month later, they had the same problem. They solved that. A month later, they had virtually the same problem. And so from a storytelling sense, that can be disastrous. And so the trick, I think, for us was to really own that and to own the details of the story. We started by thinking, well, do we go later into the 70s? Things that people know, Son of Sam, the blackouts, et cetera, the cultural stuff. And while we see glimpses of cultural things, because that was happening in the city, we actually, I think, cracked it open when we said, no, we're going to own the substance of the film, not hopefully as a wonky thing, but come out the other side and say, no, it has something profound to say about what kind of society we lived in back then, the questions we were wrestling with. And then given when we're releasing it right now, the state of the world, both in California and countrywide, the relationship between local governments and the federal government, it's incredibly relevant. And I think the same questions that are coming up in that 1 year period that we framed the film around are very dynamic today.
Yeah. Although I did describe the broad outlines of the film in the introduction, I think it's important to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what exactly and what was happening in New York City. And you can't talk about it, in my mind, without talking about Abe. I didn't know him. Obviously, he wasn't my mayor. I didn't get, but I thought the way that he's portrayed in the film is fair, and also, to my mind, as a viewer, very sympathetic, given the circumstances that he found himself in. But let's talk about sort of him as mayor, and then beginning to realize what was happening to the city, and why no one seemed to be either concerned or didn't see it coming.
Abe Beame was a career politician. He had come up through the ranks of the machine politics of the 1950s, 60s, really started out in the 40s. So he was already a fairly older man by the time he was elected mayor. He had also been controller of the city prior to that under Lindsay. So arguably, he should have known very well about the condition of the city's finances. There was a kind of a perfect storm of problems with revenue for the city from white flight, draining the city's coffers, overwhelming needs of an incoming population, and rising interest rates that sort of mingled with the basic incompetence of the controller's office in City Hall that surprised everyone. I think Beame is generally overlooked by history. And in our story, he is not a hero. He's not the one who figured it out. But we decided that he was the one we would track because he's a very sympathetic guy. I mean, you want somebody you can relate to. And many of these politicians are statesmen, especially when the camera is rolling. They speak in a cadence that has a certain kind of, rhetoric. And Beame, the minute he talks, there's a frankness to who he is. He wears his emotions on his face. And so that was kind of helpful to sort of say, maybe this is our guy. And yeah, the history has been pretty merciless with him. I think he was crushed by it. He's somebody who went into politics to hire people, not fire people. And in fact, we didn't, there are stories of him, he would fire people and then hire them back right away. He just couldn't do what he had to do. So yeah, that's a little bit of a primer on Abe Beame, one-term mayor in New York City.
Although we don't see him in sort of more personal setting, we see him mostly in the film in kind of in front of cameras and sort of on the spot for what has happened. But throughout it, and you're able to capture this in other ways, that he was genuinely a man of New York and genuinely someone who this almost couldn't have happened to a more inappropriate person for that to happen.
Born and bred, fully a New York character, absolutely. As was Hugh Carey. They both came out of the Brooklyn Democratic machine. Yeah. They were both rookies. Hugh Carey had been a congressman for many, many years. And neither of them were ready for what happened, and it happened very fast.
Yeah, and then at some point in the film, and in this roiling kind of fiscal disaster that New York City faced, you have all of these different institutions in New York. And again, one of the things, Peter, I think you capture so beautifully in this film is all of these different interests. We have the unions, we have the banks, we have the culture of New York City kind of, and that's another thing. I don't think people truly appreciate New York City for its roots, for its commonality, the common man part of New York City. And I thought that is brought out in the film very effectively. So, Peter, let's talk about these as they're discovering some discrepancies, shall we say, in the fiscal world for New York City. Let's talk about the institutions to some extent of what kind of were brought to bear on the situation.
And I think picking up what you and Michael were just discussing, each of those groups, the major players, the unions, the banks, the media, the cultural elements, all of these entities were, in a way that's hard for us perhaps to understand today, truly local. Now you think of bankers and you think of digital transnational capital, and I'm not underselling this. There was international finance, but the huge majority, most if not all of the major banks were headquartered in New York who were players in this thing. The media, there weren't 20 million Instagram accounts with 19 million different spins on what's going on. There were a handful of outlets that could broadcast the news with, you know, X number of reporters. And if you lied to the face of somebody, and certainly people lied, not to be naive, it's not like in the 70s politics, nobody ever lied. But there was a humanity to all of this, is what we found in the footage, where you had to be face to face. If we were doing this interview with you every day for 17 years, it would be at our own risk to completely make something else. We have to face you again tomorrow. And so there's this kind of almost beautiful, I wouldn't say not naivete, but there's a current of honesty and directness, if you will, that comes through in the footage, both with the media, which is a way that we tell the story. We use the anchors and the newscasts a lot to kind of drive things along, but even with the banks, and they certainly can be blamed for a lot, and they had their share of villainous behavior. But even they had a vested interest. They lived in the city in making it work, and certainly the unions were similar as well. But it's kind of turtles all the way down, because it wasn't just unions versus banks versus government versus this. Within the unions, they each had different interests, which sometimes overlapped, but very often didn't. And getting them all in the room was remarkable. It was a remarkable achievement, but it's also remarkable for the film, because all of these characters who represent these entities are literally larger than life. And it's all playing out kind of on camera and on the streets of New York. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I found so fascinating is that, especially with the people that were involved with unions, whether they were leadership or more rank and file, the directness. And seeing it, in front of a bank of microphones, the head of the teachers union, the guy, the sanitation, the head of the sanitation department, all these people were raw and as you were just describing, honest. And you could just almost feel, I've been in New York in the summer. I could feel the summer heat, if you will, in some of this footage and watching it play out. And there was genuine crisis, genuine. I want to make sure people understand. It feels like New York was literally falling apart during this period of time.
Well, nothing. I mean, my joke is it's Dog Day Afternoon with 8 million hostages instead of 20. The grittiness is, I have to say it was pretty well conveyed by films of that period, because it does sort of jump out as, oh, that's what that looks like. And one of our very lucky things is that this was the last year that the evening news was shot on 60 millimeter film. This was right before the transition to video. So our archive is, an amazingly gorgeous filmic archive of a very decaying place. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Peter, there's some shots of, obviously there was the garbage strike during this. I think that's unfortunately, I think what most people visually remember about all of this is the garbage strike or the sanitation strike. But that there's one particular moment in the film where this woman is up in the third story of an apartment complex, and she's literally talking about there's no one here. I have, what am I doing? How am I going to survive? This is arguably the preeminent city in the world, and people are shouting out their windows for help. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would be, one of the things that we wrestled with would be, in Hollywood parlance or traditional documentary parlance, if you were making an advocacy film or like a very clean and, somewhat more simple narrative, what's the takeaway? What's the one line takeaway? X is good, Y is bad. And I think it's something we wrestled with, because it's easy to look at a lot of the extreme problems that existed back then, as embodied by that woman and lots of other, characters large and small in the movie. And there was amazing coming together that happened in the film and solving this immediate problem. And since that time, the budget of New York has been balanced, which is a remarkable achievement. And more or less, the government stays, on the rails compared to what it was back then. And yet, the city still has a lot of people like that woman in it today. There still are, many too many homeless children, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not an easy success or failure story. Like all hard things, it's complicated and hard things are hard. And that's something that Michael's father really engineered and did the difficult work. And I think if there is a takeaway to my mind, that's one of them. At a time where everything is considered to be good or bad, or this is really hard, or if we can't do it perfectly, you're not going to do it. You know what? This was a massive problem. It was massively complicated. There were great successes made, but there remain massive challenges. So the city, yes, was in dire straits back then, and in some ways, it's a much improved, wonderful place. But there are other sides of it that are still quite scarred and difficult today.
There's some statistics that are quoted at the end of the film that are disturbing about the wealth gap in New York City. There's some other issues, obviously. I think that's part of what you're talking about. But let's talk about Felix Rohatyn and how he, as I mentioned to you before we got started, I remembered his face when I saw him in the film because he, although I don't think he would be considered a high prominent player in terms of the national perception of this, he was very memorable and especially calm under the circumstances. Michael, let's talk about your father, Felix.
Well, he had been an investment banker. He was probably in his 40s, and this is in a period of time when being an investment banker was not the crazy casino rich thing that it is now. It was a pretty dull profession. He was called by the governor. There weren't many Democrats on Wall Street, and you have a governor who's Democrat who learns of a crisis started at the state level, then was way worse when everyone learned of New York's own problems, and cast around for somebody in the Wall Street world who might be relied upon to kind of be trustworthy to the banks, to the capital markets. And he asked my father through some kind of connection of like, who do you know down there? And my father came in very much unprepared. One of my delights making this over these many years is being able to watch him go from the very early days of his involvement, where you can see that he's a bit nervous, he's kind of bashful on the camera, and then he gets his footing. And it happened that my father really kind of liked it. He liked being in front of the media, but he also really liked being able to be direct, and he was really good at it. So I think he established trust with all of the different, entities. He became lifelong friends with one of the union guys, Victor Gottbaum, and he just loved it. He loved New York City. And he loved New York City because of all of those people. He was not an elitist kind of, he just loved those people. So it was great for him. Great. He really, I think it changed his life.
There's some description of him in these meetings and how he was determined, how determined he was as a person to get things done, which was sorely needed at that point, especially in the part of this film that we see him in. I just want to remind our listeners we're speaking with Peter Yost and Michael Rohatyn. They are the co-directors of a remarkable documentary film. I mean, if you want a masterclass in how to tell a complex story, Drop Dead City is where you should go. You want to figure out how to tell it with a lot of different moving parts and a lot of history and a lot of different personalities and interests.
Mike, we should definitely on the resonating from that very kind, description. We should mention our great editors, Don Cleese and Anna Auster, who are documentaries are made by the editors, and they did an incredible job. While me and Peter bugged them every day, and not to minimize us. And Frauke Levin, who is the archival producer, was the one who got all of that footage. So that there's a lot of credit to be shared there.
Absolutely. And I just also want to let people know that Drop Dead City is going to be screening here in the Los Angeles area at the one and only Laemmle Theater chain. There's 3 different venues. You're going to be at, I believe you're going to be at 23rd and 24th at the Monica Film Center, which I also believe you'll be there for Q&As. And also, it will also be screening at the Town Center 5.
Yeah, we're at the Monica for the week.
Yeah, sorry, we're doing Q&As, I think. We personally are doing Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but then it plays at the Monica for the week, I think. Yeah.
Very good. There are a number of ways you can go to dropdeadcitythemovie.com to find out more about it and all.
It's also going to be streaming online sometime in the middle of summer in mid-July.
Perfect time.
Yeah.
Perfect time for it to come out. For me, there's a number of illustrative moments in the film, so many, but one that's really stuck with me. Well, and it's just a brief part of the film, which is the discussion between Walter Heller and Milton Friedman, which I think beautifully encapsulates the world we live in today. And it was being made clear by Milton Friedman that's the world he wanted us to live in, which don't get me started, and also a few others that pop in and out. Donna Shalala, who was in the Carter administration, Paul Volcker, who was basically kind of the dark prince in all of this, and also Bill Simon, William Simon, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney make cameo appearances. Ronald Reagan. There's so much here to just kind of chew on.
It's great. We put it all in too.
No, I was going to say, well, the funny thing for us, I think, was beginning it and knowing it was a great narrow story of that moment. But the more we got into it, the more resonant it became with today.
Yes.
And I think I'm grateful that that resonated for you, that the Heller Milton Friedman thing, because I think that's something that we, at a certain point, I don't know how many months or years into this process, but for both of us, if you were to distill down, it's kind of right there in the middle of the movie, and it kind of gives you an intellectual framework, if you care to do so, to kind of stick your claws into and helps orient all the other chaos around it. So I'm glad that that kind of resonated, and I think that's something from a storytelling standpoint that took us a bit of time, but when we saw that, it seemed really resonant.
That, we also tried not to point the finger at any one villain. We tried to stay kind of balanced and you pretty much get all of the points of view by the time you're at the end of the film. But what was lovely about that Friedman Heller thing is it's still a movie about ideas.
Exactly.
That was a great thing when we decided. We kind of looked at each other. It was like, this should be in. This is exactly what we're talking about. It's not about, any one scene, or it's not about any one event, but it ends up being the kind of the central conversation in a way.
And the dramatic shift in the Republican Party, as seen by Nelson Rockefeller, who became Gerald Ford's vice president in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, and to see he couldn't get elected dog catcher in the Republican Party today,
right?
All of his money put together.
Right. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld and Cheney, they detested him, there's a great sequence in our film, we think, that works very well to convey that. It's also worth noting that in the 1976 cycle, they drove Rockefeller off the ticket, and they brought in Bob Dole from Kansas. So it just seems like this is sort of the beginning of that playbook of kind of looking at the central states and kind of demonizing the elites, whether they're Republican or Democrats, right, from the coast.
Well, and a very different philosophy of at least what was referred to as country club Republicans, right, back then, and all that kind of stuff. But Rockefeller at least had a sense of the city, had a sense of its place, the sense of making things work, which is pretty remarkable. To both of you, I cannot recommend this film highly enough because it is so... It's interesting. It's the personalities that we have in the film, the people who made this happen and not made it happen. Let's not forget kind of the John Osnato, the
right,
question that he asked, and how one little tiny little thing, like the guy, like Alexander Butterfield from Watergate, when he asked, taping system in the White House, in the Oval Office. It's that same kind of, it resonated the same way. It's like,
it was amazing we were able to find them. These
I
guys,
know.
And they were still there. Now, many of them have passed, which is very sad. But it was very, one of the lovely things was to interview somebody and then say, well, where do you think we should go now? They say, well, you should talk to that person. And then we would sort of follow the...
And nobody, for better or worse, perhaps for good reason, but had tracked him down for 50 years. And he actually lives just, a half mile down the road from I guess both of us here in Brooklyn. And so we went over there one afternoon, not knowing what we were going to get. And he's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I
I remember
pulled
that.
out the straw that broke the camel's back of New York City."
Wow. And there was a time when they were talking about Hugh Carey, governor of the state of New York, as a possible either presidential or presidential candidate. I mean, there's so many big personalities. The rise of Ronald Reagan. We see a little bit of him in here. There's so much here. There's so much here. So, Mike, again, fantastic stuff. Drop Dead City. Again, it's coming out here in Los Angeles this weekend, so be looking for it if you're in the area of the Lemleys up in the Los Angeles area. There's the NoHo 7, which is in North Hollywood, the Monica Film Center down in Santa Monica and Town Center, which I believe is Encino, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're in that area, and these filmmakers, both of them, Michael Rohatyn and Peter Yost, are in town for Q&As. You can go to dropdeadcitythemovie.com to find out all about this. You can also go to the Lemley website as well. Thank you guys so very much for your time today. Thank you so much for this incredible film. Thank you.
Oh, Mike, thank you so much for this lovely, wonderful interview and those kind words.
A real pleasure.